Good.
Hi, so I want to welcome you all to my Bible study. Today we're going to be looking at the story of Joseph in Genesis. And this is my favorite story in the Bible because it really is a beautiful arc of the God's redeeming plan that is so evident throughout the whole Bible. It's almost like a little simplified version of that. And so we're going to start with the beginning. This is the beginning of my 4-part series. So we're going to look at Genesis 37. And this part will really focus on the concept of suffering. And so as we dive into that, we look at what makes a villain. So some of us will say that is someone who harms another person, who loves power, or takes matters into their own hands through conniving ways or things like that. But we'll see here that the brothers are kind of seen as the villains in this story. But we'll see also that the attributes of a villain are actually not far off from just ordinary people with ordinary lives, just like you and me. And so this passage, though, the main theme that is throughout all of it is that God is in control. But when we take control for ourselves, the results can be fear, guilt, and suffering of the innocent. And so as we look in Genesis 37, it starts off with a boy named Joseph, and he is the youngest of 12 brothers, and from the line of Jacob, which is from the line of Abraham, God's chosen people. And he has a dream that all of his brothers and everyone is going to bow down to him. And so we're going to see Joseph's brothers' response. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that the fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of his hand, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into the pit here in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of the hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, and on the way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him into the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." His brothers listened to him. The Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him into the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. And so, in this story, we saw Joseph, he was betrayed by his brothers and ultimately sold into Egypt. And so as we look through this, we're going to look at, there's a couple themes that are evident throughout this passage. Themes of power, fear, guilt, and suffering. So starting with power, there's lots of power dynamics here at play. Joseph, he is the youngest brother, which culturally they did not have a lot of power. Yet he is one who was actually promised a lot, not only through the dream, but also we can see it through his title of, they even said, "Here comes this dreamer." And even if we look at the word dreamer in the Hebrew, it actually means owner, master, and lord, as well as dreamer. So it's almost interesting, like this destiny that he is given is right from the very beginning. And he also has this robe that it said in many colors that really shows the favor that Jacob had for his son. And yet, even though he was the youngest, he had all this power that was promised to him. And the elder brothers, they have power. They're older and everything, but they have this threat upon them. And so what do? They try to gain more power. They try to gain control over this situation. And so this kind of also looks at this theme of that we shouldn't take power into our own hands. And Reuben and Judah, they kind of come up with this plot again to get rid of Joseph without killing him. And they used their power as oldest brothers for evil, ultimately. They could have been like, guys, no, like, this is not good, let's not kill our brother. But instead they just let that aside and were like, okay, well, like, let's just not kill him, but sell him. And so, again, they're using their power into their own hands in this kind of conniving way. And God had a plan to give Joseph power, and God is not really mentioned in this passage, but we will see later out throughout the whole story of Joseph even that he's kind of this third character that is weaving this whole story together. And so God had this plan to give Joseph power with the dream and everything. And like all plans of God, it is good and it is perfect. And the brothers, they didn't trust God's plan, and they went against Joseph, Jacob, their father, and even God. But we will see later on in the study even that God will use this scheme that the brothers made to use Joseph being sold into slavery to actually fulfill God's purpose for redeeming the world and redeeming Israel in this time. But also we look at this part of this passage and this theme of fear. So the brothers were driven by fear, the fear of having to bow down, because submitting sounded so terrible to them. But is it? Is submission bad if it's under a perfect God's plan? But we do not need to be afraid of the future, for God's will is good and it is perfect. But also, we look at this theme of guilt. So once again, the brothers were driven by fear, they did this evil act, and ultimately they were plagued with guilt. We'll see in the verses leading after this passage, Reuben went back to look for Joseph and didn't find him there, and even tore his robes of guilt and remorse. And Jacob, his father, even just mourned the loss of his son because the brothers tricked him into the fact that Joseph died. And so even Reuben and Judah, they even feared the guilt even before they did the act. They were like, no, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him into the pit and then later maybe sell him or whatever, And so the guilt they felt even drove those situations. And they kind of justified their sin by not killing him. However, we just can't justify sin. And that's what the brothers tried to do, and they tried to be the hero, but that ultimately failed because you just can't justify sin. And so again, all this leads to suffering, which is our final theme of this passage, where suffering is something that is both given and it is received in this passage. It is inflicted upon by the brothers, and it is received by Joseph. And suffering is caused by the sin of others, but also of oneself. And in this case, the brothers are the ones who cause this sin of the innocent. Because when we try to take control, suffering happens. So let us not inflict suffering onto others, because the results could be catastrophic. The suffering of Joseph was, he went to jail and he was in slavery and all these things, and he was innocent because he was the one who received the suffering. He's the victim in this story of hatred and fear, and he was betrayed and even sold into slavery. It's actually kind of interesting because the first time I read this passage, I immediately thought of Jesus and how this is really a parallel to that story of when Jesus was betrayed. We see, he was paid pieces of silver for being betrayed, and he was surrounded by 12 brothers, just like Jesus was surrounded by 12 apostles. And he was taken away to suffer, he was betrayed, and he was innocent. And he was even claimed to be king of the Jews, and that's why he died. And Joseph claimed that he was going to be a ruler, and that's why he ended up being thrown into suffering as well. And so, even though he was the victim and everything, something that we can just take from this story and words of encouragement that I just have for all of us is that God's plan is greater, and he will work through the evil in this world for good. So we don't see this right now because this is just the beginning stages of Joseph's story, but we will see later on the redemptive arc that will come between the brothers in this family drama. This is just the beginning stages of that. And all these evil acts towards Joseph caused him to suffer, yet later on again we will see that God has favor on him, so he actually thrives because of this and saves so many people. And so God had favor on Joseph, and God has favor on you. And when we have evil deeds done against us, let us trust in God's underworking hand to save us. And also, let us examine our own lives and see where we're driven by fear, guilt, and power. And sometimes it can be like, okay, well, I'm not trying to kill my brother or something extreme as that. But this story, again, shows us that actually, even though the brothers are seen as the villains, we actually could be just easily villains as well. For example, I just want to relate this to our life right now with the coronavirus. As funny as that may be, it actually is a really cool story. It really shows exactly what people are running to in this time. Because just as Joseph and his brothers, they had a threat against them. And so what did? They ran to fear, into power, into all these different things. And this coronavirus right now, it's a threat into our lives. And I think this is really showing where people are running to. Some people, they are so caught up in fear and just want to cower back or not love others through this. Or some people with power can often sometimes be seen or come across as entitlement too. You know, people are running to the stores and stocking up and hoarding up and not thinking of others because they're entitled. No, this is for me and I deserve this and I deserve to live and all these different things. And people just aren't trusting in God. And so how quick it is, how, you know, we're all just going on our normal lives, but how quick is it that we can actually turn into a villain? And so as we wrap up today, we looked at God and how he's control, but when we take control for ourselves, the results are fear, guilt, and suffering of the innocent. We saw this with the betrayal of Joseph, but just as it unfolds in the story and the narrative of the Bible, God is victorious over evil, and he will work for the amongst the evil for our good. And what we can learn from this passage is to examine where in our lives we may actually be abusing power or seeking power at the expense of other people. Where in our lives are we driven by fear and guilt? Because we can be just as easily corrupted and be the villain. Or maybe we already are. And so, again, I want just some encouragement for you that trust in God's plan and do not take matters into your own hands because God's ways are good and they are perfect. Thank you.